Welcome to our latest Wandering Walks of Wonder adventure. Today we're headed to the historic city of Bartlesville, Oklahoma. Bartlesville was started by Jacob Bartles, who married into the Delaware tribe through Chief Charles Journeycake's family. He relocated from Wyandotte County, Kansas to Indian Territory in 1873. Initially, he settled near Silver Lake, which is just south of present-day Bartlesville, and established a trading post and post office on Turkey Creek in 1874. Expanding his enterprises, Bartles acquired a grist mill on the Caney River in 1875 and then soon converted that to flour production. His entrepreneurial spirit led to the construction of a two-story general store and residence, along with amenities like a rooming house, blacksmith shop, and livery stable. This growing settlement, initially dubbed Bartles Town, attracted other settlers, prompting Bartles to move his Turkey Creek post office to the town in 1880. He further enhanced the community by providing essential services like electricity, a telephone network, and a water distribution system. The evolution of Bartlesville into its present city began with the establishment of a general store by William Johnstone and George B. Keeler on the south side of the Caney River in 1884. The town's first newspaper began in 1895, and the city itself was incorporated in January of 1897. Bartlesville was surveyed and platted in 1898, offering 80 acres to the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railroad for a depot. This is a later iteration of that depot that we're seeing here today. The railroad reached the town in 1899, and the post office was relocated from North Bartlesville here into the city of Bartlesville, also in 1899. The Bartlesville Union Depot was designed in the Spanish Mission style of architecture. It was completed in 1909, and throughout its history it served two major railroads, the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe, and the Missouri, Kansas, and Texas Railroad. The last train to depart from the station was in 1971, and the building was boarded up until 1984. But that year, the Phillips Petroleum Company purchased the building, completely renovated it, and donated the building to the city of Bartlesville, and it's used today as a visitor center. This steam locomotive that we're looking at is one of the last steam locomotives that the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railroad built. It was constructed in 1903 and spent nearly 50 years traveling between Tulsa, Oklahoma, and Chinook, Kansas. This angular building that we see here on 2nd Street was once the first city hall in Bartlesville and was initially constructed in 1903. The brick building was used for city administration purposes until a much larger city hall was constructed in 1910. It was then mainly used as retail space until the 1930s, when a new building was added just to the left of the old city hall and eventually became a major bus depot. In the 1940s, the brick was covered over in stucco around the same time that Union Station was renovated. As we take a walk through the downtown area, you can still see many glimpses of what the city looked like in the past. In the early 1900s, there were very few cars in the Bartlesville area. Most people arrived into Bartlesville from their homes or ranches in horse and buggy carriages. Visitors arriving into town from the nearby depot couldn't just rent a car, but needed access while doing business. They often went to a livery stable that was here in town that allowed them to rent a horse and a carriage so that they could do some of their work in town. Some of the other buildings that were in the downtown area, some of the historic buildings, include Ideal Concrete, or Ideal Cleaners. This building was constructed in the 1900s and is believed to be one of the oldest buildings that still exist in the downtown area. A little bit later on in our walk, we're going to be going past the historic Price Tower, one of the most famous landmark buildings in Bartlesville. But before we get there, it's interesting to know that the Price Company began in a small brick commercial building here in the old downtown area of Bartlesville. In 1921, Harold Price opened the Electra Welding Shop here on 2nd Street. Price perfected his technique for welding pipe using electricity. And in the booming early days of the oil industry here in Oklahoma, the ability to transport oil through strong welded pipelines was crucial to the growth of the industry. The Price Pipeline Company became Oklahoma's largest pipeline contractor within a few years. And during World War II, Price had contracts with the U.S. government and soon became the largest pipeline contractor in the world. Price moved his extremely successful business to the newly constructed Price Tower in 1956 when it was completed, and we'll see that tower here just a little bit later on. Ahead of us is the Doenges Stadium. The earliest baseball team to form in Bartlesville was called the Bartlesville Brickbats. They started playing way back in 1895. The first stadium the team played in had a roofed grandstand that allowed about 500 fans to watch the game. In 1930, the city passed a bond to build a new concrete stadium. The municipal athletic field was dedicated in 1932. During its long history, this stadium has hosted rodeos, religious revivals, a circus, and many other community events. For many years, the local high school football team played inside the stadium until a dedicated football field was constructed in the 1950s. In 1997, the field was renamed the Doenges Stadium. Mr. Doenges was a lifelong supporter of the American Legion baseball program and owned the Doenges Ford Indians, later changed to Indians, baseball team. This Grecian-style building once housed the Church of Christ Scientists in Bartlesville. The Church of Christ Scientists first met in Bartlesville in 1910. This church was built in 1926 and remained the home of the Church of Christ Scientists until 2011. The church has recently been renovated into a private residence. This ornate church here, the First Christian Church, sits among several in the area of downtown Bartlesville. The First Christian Church was organized in Bartlesville in 1897. The congregation purchased this lot on South Osage Street and met in the basement of the structure until the church was completed in 1910. The church has been remodeled extensively over the years. The first renovation occurred in 1925, and the present building was totally renovated in 1950. If the Bartlesville Community Center looks like something straight out of a Frank Lloyd Wright design handbook, you wouldn't be too far off. This building was designed by William Peters. Peters was the first student and protege of Wright who graduated from the Wright-Taliesin Architectural School in Phoenix, Arizona. The sweeping curves, ovals, and circles used in the design make this one of the most unique buildings in the entire Bartlesville area. The community center was completed in 1982. Inside the building is a 1,700-seat theater that showcases orchestral performances, dance exhibitions, and touring Broadway shows. We're now walking towards a historic building, which is also a National Historic Landmark. The Price Tower was built in 1956 and is the only true skyscraper that famous architect Frank Lloyd Wright ever designed. Price Tower stands about 221 feet tall. It is built in a unique cantilever design typical of many of Wright's design elements in homes and other buildings he planned. All of the floors and walls in the building extend from just 4 interior vertical shafts. In effect, none of these exterior walls you see are structural. They are simply an extension from those 4 shafts. Harold Price, as mentioned earlier, was the successful owner of the largest pipeline manufacturing company in the world. Without many of Price's innovations, getting oil from the wells to manufacturing facilities would have been impossible to have achieved. As we saw earlier in the walk, Price began his pipeline welding business in the downtown area in a small commercial building in 1921, but by the 1950s his company had become so successful that he was able to commission one of the most famous structures in the United States. Inside the building are many of the elements that are known by Wright, including such things as his furniture and paintings that Wright himself chose. Wright was famous for using space to create a dramatic feel to the homes and buildings he designed. In many of his homes, the hallways would be narrow and ceilings very low, but as you walked through the often dark hallway, a feeling of mystery would envelop your senses and you came to a large, open, sunlit room that was often quite expansive. He designed that same feeling of mystery inside the Price Tower. The elevators are deliberately very small and almost claustrophobic, but when you reach the upper floors, the elevator doors open into rooms and offices that would take up nearly the entire floor. When Price Tower first opened in the 1950s, most of the space on the upper floors was used by the Price Company. Some of the lower floors included other office tenants such as lawyers, doctors, and accountants. There was even a women's high-end dress shop and a beauty salon on the lower floors. Several floors also had residential apartments. Of course, Harold Price and later his son occupied the highest floor of the tower with their offices. They even had apartments on the floor for those nights when they didn't want to head for home. In the early 1980s, Price moved his company to Dallas and sold the Price Tower to Phillips Petroleum. Lawyers for Phillips were concerned about the exterior exit staircase. They thought it would be a poor safety risk for their employees, so Phillips never put employees' offices inside the building. The building was simply used as storage. In 2000, Phillips donated the Price Tower to a nonprofit group called the Price Tower Arts Center, and the building now houses an art museum and another museum dedicated to Frank Lloyd Wright. There's also an upscale restaurant on one of the upper floors. You can even sleep in several of the apartments that once were used inside Price Tower. The Inn at Price Tower is a member of the Historic Hotels of America. Although the rooms are pricey, the views are great inside the rooms. This old fire station that we see here on Johnstone Avenue is one of 4 that serves Bartlesville. This particular station is also the central station for the city and is where the administration and fire chief operations reside. In the late 1920s, the city of Bartlesville needed a new post office. So all post office services were moved to this federal building in 1932. This particular building was constructed just 2 years earlier and served as a federal courthouse for many years. After the federal courthouse and post office moved out of the building, the Washington County Courthouse moved here. The county had outgrown the building, as we saw an earlier version of this earlier in the walk. Across the street from the federal building is the old Mayor Hotel, which is now Bartlesville City Hall and Museum. In the early days of Oklahoma statehood, virtually every city and town had one major hotel near the railroad station, which became the center of entertainment and business activities for the area. This hotel was constructed in 1913, and it was designed in the popular Italianate architectural style that was known in that era. It was financed by the Mayer brothers, who came from Ohio. The brick and concrete building was also one of the best fireproof buildings constructed in the early 1900s in Bartlesville. When it opened, the interior had crystal chandeliers and large ceiling fans. Both of those operated using electricity, which was just starting to make its appearance in Bartlesville in the early 1900s. In the 1920s, a Frigidaire air conditioning system was installed, and it was the first cooling system in a hotel west of the Mississippi River. We're now headed through a portion of Bartlesville that is the heart of what makes this town so prosperous, the Phillips Petroleum Company. Today, the company is called ConocoPhillips after Conoco and Phillips merged in 2012. The driving force behind Phillips Petroleum was Frank Phillips. Phillips was born in Nebraska but grew up in Iowa. He was driven to be the best at what he set out to do. As a young man in Creston, Iowa, he became a barber. But rather than just run his own little shop, he set out to purchase every barber shop in town. After barbering for a while, Frank Phillips became a financier and businessman. He got a job selling bonds and was soon traveling around the Midwest working to make himself and others rich. While traveling through Oklahoma, which was then called Indian Territory, he heard about an oil field that had recently been discovered near a town called Bartlesville. This was in 1903, and the oil boom was just about to happen. He decided after visiting the town that he could make more money as a banker, so he used his savings and organized the Citizens Bank and Trust Company, which we'll see that building here in just a bit. Not long after, the oil boom really exploded in the area, and Phillips Bank became the financial institute of choice for many of the companies and workers who were just beginning to strike it rich. Frank Phillips quickly saw the petroleum industry was going to explode across Oklahoma, so he asked his brother, L.E. Phillips, to join him in Bartlesville. The brothers used their fortunes from the banking industry to purchase leases and wells. In 1917, the brothers incorporated the Phillips Petroleum Company. While Frank was always the financier and businessman, it was his brother, L.E., who expanded Phillips Petroleum into the giant corporation it would become. In 1925, Phillips Petroleum began construction on its corporate headquarters here on Keeler Avenue. The first building constructed was the Frank Phillips Building. This was a large 8-story structure used to house the hundreds of workers needed to keep the corporation moving forward. In 1927, this large Phillips Tower was completed. While the old Phillips Building itself no longer exists, it was torn down to make room for the newer, more modern buildings we see today. The Phillips Tower remains as a reminder of the beginning of the company that began over 100 years ago. This large Italianate building that we see in the downtown area was completed in 1920 for Union National Bank. The bank was owned by H.V. Foster, who also started Foster Petroleum. The bank operated out of the first floor of the building, while the upper floors were used as professional offices for accountants, lawyers, and doctors. A number of smaller oil companies have also occupied this space inside this building. Here on our right, we're walking past, you'll see with the green marble is the Citizens Bank and Trust building. This is really, even though small, it's a historic building in the downtown area. The very first offices for Phillips Petroleum Company were located on the second floor of this building. When Frank Phillips came to Bartlesville, he originally started as a banker, and he organized and became president here at Citizens Bank and Trust Company. That bank was formed in 1905. But shortly after opening the bank, as mentioned earlier, Phillips found that there was a more lucrative opportunity in the expanding industry of petroleum drilling. He sent for his brother to come help him run the bank and help with the drilling efforts. Within 15 years, that business had grown to such an extent that the Phillips brothers were able to purchase the First National Bank for $425,000, which was quite a bit of money in the 1920s. After purchasing First National Bank, they moved their petroleum company offices to much larger spaces inside the First National Bank building. This large building that we see in front of us is known as the Masonic Empire Building. It was constructed in 1918 when the local Masonic organization leased the upper floors of the building. As we head out of the downtown area, just a little bit south or north of the downtown area is the Nellie Johnston No. 1 derrick. Bartlesville became a very prosperous and successful town due to the discovery of oil. Here in Johnstone Park, you're looking at the first commercially productive oil well in the entire state of Oklahoma. At the time the first oil started flowing from the well, Oklahoma wasn't even a state. It was still part of Indian Territory. Funding for this derrick was provided by George Keeler and William Johnstone. Both Keeler and Johnstone had married Native American women and were adopted into the tribes of their wives. They had moved to Indian Territory in the late 1800s to operate a dry goods store. As the land they were living on belonged to the Osage and Delaware nations, Keeler and Johnstone had to lease the land with their wives' backing. In April 1897, this well was constructed and a borehole was drilled down to 1,300 feet. To release the oil, Keeler's stepdaughter dropped a liquid nitroglycerin charge into the well. This fractured the well cap and oil soon exploded over the top of the derrick. And from that day onwards, 50 to 75 barrels of oil were produced from this well. It was named the Nellie Johnstone after the youngest child of William Johnstone. Soon after oil was released, the well had to be capped for several years while Keeler and Johnstone tried to figure out a way to transport the oil. In 1899, the railroad came to town and a quick and easy transportation method for the crude oil was soon in operation. During its lifetime, the Nellie Johnstone well produced over 100,000 barrels of oil and was finally capped in 1948. I hope you've enjoyed this Wandering Walks of Wonder here in downtown Bartlesville. If you have been to Bartlesville before or part of the oil industry, leave a comment on some of the buildings or sites or things to see in Bartlesville. Otherwise, make sure to hit that like and subscribe button, and we will see you on our next Wandering Walks of Wonder adventure. Take care now. Bye-bye.